me! Help! Let me out of here!
There's something going on in this room.
Silent Hill is one of the oldest survival horror franchises out there, and it spans from the 1990s, when the PS1 was the ultimate console, all the way to this very day in 2025. Over the course of decades, the franchise was handled by multiple studios and developers from different backgrounds in both Japan and the West, leading to the release of various games that bear the same name and concept but still have their unique style that makes each one distinct. The last entry in the series is Silent Hill F, and it was released recently in September 2025, 3 years after it was revealed in 2022. The reception of this game by both reviewers and casual players was a little bit bizarre, because you can see people saying it's the best Silent Hill game in the franchise, while on the other side, you can see someone claiming it's the worst game they ever played. But beside these contrasting and personal judgments, there is a specific phrase that was mentioned all over the place and was used as an argument against the game by anyone who wants to shut down the debate. The phrase is, "It's not a Silent Hill game." And it was repeatedly present in so many comments on social media, videos on YouTube, and reviews on Steam. In their perspective, this was the ultimate issue with Silent Hill F, and it cannot be overlooked, regardless of how much the game excels in gameplay, story, and atmosphere. This begs the question, what the hell a Silent Hill game is, and what makes certain games qualify for the name, while others don't? Well, to learn more about this phenomenon, we need first to understand when it started. For people who started playing or following the Silent Hill franchise after its revival recently, the idea of questioning a game's identity and its connection to Silent Hill might be something new, that's only relevant to the modern era. But in reality, this idea actually started more than 20 years ago, specifically in 2004 when Silent Hill 4 was released. In the early 2000s, Silent Hill was going through its golden age, especially after the surprising success of Silent Hill 2, not only financially, but also as a media that people wanted to learn about, even if they didn't play the game. When Silent Hill 3 saw the light later on in 2003, it was also praised for multiple reasons, including its disturbing story, its incredibly refined combat, and its direct connection to the original game. However, 1 year later in 2004, Silent Hill 4 came out suddenly from nowhere, and the release window was weird because it happened very fast after Silent Hill 3. This was a turning point in the franchise's history, because Silent Hill 4 was different and unique. And frankly, that's exactly what led to its downfall. We already explained the game multiple times on the channel, but to keep it short, the story centers around a man named Henry, who lives in apartment room number 302 in Ashfield, which is a city located close to Silent Hill. Over time, Henry began to notice supernatural events in his place, and one day, he found himself stuck inside his apartment and unable to leave it. For some reason, he cannot open the door due to heavy chains all over it, but he can still see from the peephole and hear the sounds outside, including his neighbors talking to each other.
Everything looks pretty normal to me. The guy who lives here, what's he like anyway?
A few days later, Henry made another shocking discovery when he found a mysterious hole on his bathroom's wall, which eventually turned out to be a portal to a nightmarish alternate reality. In this world, he met several people who seem normal, but they will end up getting killed at some point, and each one of them has a spooky number on their body. The scary part is that all these people were already dead in the real world, and they were killed by a serial killer named Walter Sullivan, a man who is obsessed with room 302, the same place where Henry lives. Walter has a tragic history as a child. because after his birth, he was abandoned by his parents in room 302, and he never saw them. Subsequently, he was taken to a hospital nearby before he eventually ended up in an orphanage, where he spent his childhood and learned everything about the world. The problem is that this orphanage was run by the Order cult, and they were the primary source of education for Walter, meaning that his life was full of brainwashing. Walter had a strong obsession with reuniting with his mother, and he was convinced that room 302 is related to her, and he will find her there sooner or later. As a result, the cult somehow made him believe that the only way to meet his mother is by fulfilling a ritual called 21 Sacraments, which can only be completed by killing 21 specific people. Long story short, Walter became a ruthless serial killer, and he succeeded in taking the lives of multiple people in the town before he got arrested and died in prison. But this did not end his mission, because even after his death, he was still targeting innocent people as a ghost, and he was creating pure horror in the other worlds. Henry is actually one of the people that Walter is supposed to kill to fulfill the ritual, and this is why your journey is all about exploring the terrifying otherworlds, escaping from Walter, and finding a way to stop him. Despite Walter being arguably the best antagonist in Silent Hill's history, and the story being incredibly intriguing, players in 2004 were not really happy with the game. They had many criticisms involving the clunky combat and gameplay mechanics, but their biggest issue was that the experience doesn't feel like a Silent Hill game. Yes, you heard it right. Back in the day, Silent Hill 4 had a serious problem trying to prove its identity to many players, especially when we're talking about the hardcore loyal fans. The main reason behind their opposition was the setting and the environment, because Silent Hill 4 is the first game in the franchise where you never go to the town of Silent Hill. Even though there's references to it and characters related to its lore, people did not like the fact that you cannot explore it at any point, and you will not be able to experience the iconic fog. And believe it or not, despite the creative spooky concept of being stuck in a room, many players did not enjoy the first-person experience that you have inside. At that time, first-person horror was not very common, and it was hard for gamers to adapt to such a new feeling, especially since it was never used in any Silent Hill game before. In their eyes, it felt like the developers were trying to move away from the traditional formula, leading some of them to believe that the town of Silent Hill will not be relevant again, and the franchise is headed to a completely new vision. This ended up pushing Silent Hill 4 to be a financial flop, and it was the first in the series to receive backlash from fans because, according to them, it simply did not feel like a real Silent Hill game. The failure was so impactful that even the Japanese studio behind the entire franchise was disbanded by Konami. But the real question is, did the attitude of fans change later on, or did they keep using this argument over and over? Well, you probably know the answer. In 2008, Silent Hill Homecoming was released, and it was the first mainline entry that was made by Western developers instead of Team Silent. This time, the story is about Alex Shepard, a supposed soldier who came back to his hometown of Shepherd's Glen, only to find his brother missing, and the family is not the same at all.
Your dresses. What was that?
The town is corrupted by the other world, and this was the result of a broken agreement between its four founding families and the cult of Silent Hill. This agreement required the families, Bartlett, Fitch, Holloway, and Shepard, to sacrifice one of their children every 50 years to ensure the town's safety. But if they fail to do so, the town goes into oblivion. From this point, Alex starts a horrifying quest in which he witnesses the brutal deaths of the leaders of these founding families and manifestations of their immense guilt for sacrificing their children. The game has a complicated plot, and there are multiple surprises along the way, including the fact that Alex is not really the guy he thinks he is, and he actually has a role in the tragic fate of his brother. But even though on paper Homecoming seems like it goes back to the roots and uses the same themes of the successful Silent Hill games, people still had so much criticism for it. For example, they were very upset about the game's heavy focus on action and combat, and how the protagonist has advanced fighting abilities like dodges and melee combos. This was seen as a major departure from the survival horror foundation of the series, where the characters were often vulnerable and encouraged to flee or evade rather than fight. But at the same time, many critics also found the combat system itself to be repetitive and unsatisfying, with some calling it a poor imitation of games like Resident Evil 4. Furthermore, they didn't like the monsters, the shallow symbolism behind their designs, and the contradictions in the story. The horror in the game was seen as too obvious and too predictable, because it's not hidden well and it's always in your face, which is a far cry from the psychological horror that defined the originals. Not only that, but even the puzzles were criticized for being too simple and less sophisticated than the traditional complex thematic puzzles of previous titles. In other words, for many longtime fans, Homecoming was not a real Silent Hill game, and it was only an attempt from Western developers to compete in the action market, during a time when action horror games like Resident Evil and Dead Space were thriving. One year later, in 2009, Shattered Memories was released, which is a reimagining of the original game that was supposed to reshape the events instead of copying them directly. Once again, you play as Harry Mason, a father searching for his missing daughter, Cheryl, after a car crash in the town of Silent Hill. As usual, he must explore the town, fend off terrifying manifestations, and decipher the mysterious events unfolding around him. However, the developers did not want the game to be very similar to the source material, and they wanted to add their unique touch that makes it stand out. This led them to make the experience more psychological, and to do so, they decided to remove combat, meaning that you literally cannot fight at all. Instead, when enemies appear, the world somehow turns into a frozen nightmare, and you must run, hide, and escape. And speaking of frozen, the snow and ice are actually a general theme in the game that were used as a replacement for the classic fog and rusty decay, two elements that defined the original experience.
Harry?
How do you know me?
By now, you can probably guess where this is going, because even though Shattered Memories sold relatively well, many people in the shadows were having some problems with it. And the main problem is that the developers had so much creative liberty. The new ideas were not seen as innovations, but rather as distortions and deviations, pushing many fans to think that the game is too different from classic Silent Hill. The fact that combat is not present at all and the iconic fog is not flowing in the air did not make them impressed about the change, but instead it ended up making them scream, "It's not Silent Hill." The same energy was notable with Downpour in 2012, because at that time, many people were already expecting anything from Silent Hill to be bad by default, and they didn't have much patience for any mistakes. And to be fair, the games I mentioned so far did actually have so many flaws in their stories, mechanics, and combat. But what baffles me is that people were always questioning their identity as Silent Hill games. This made no sense because how the heck we can have a clear definition of what a Silent Hill game is if the original developers themselves did not define it? Well, this is when the Silent Hill fanbase steps in, because back in the day, there were fans who had a clear idea of what it means, and these players are divided into two groups. Following the release of Silent Hill in 1999 and the incredible success that it had, there were two groups of fans fascinated with specific elements that stood out in the experience and made the game seem special. The first group of gamers saw that the environment was the most important piece of the puzzle, because the town of Silent Hill was unique in every sense, and everything about it is a mystery. On the surface, it appears silent and secluded, but at the same time, it feels alive and hostile, creating a contrast that shook the psychology of players because it was scary in both peaceful moments and intense ones. It was an amazing example of horror in the ordinary. The places you explore feel normal, but they are also twisted, making familiar spaces seem terrifying. The second element that defines the Silent Hill experience, according to these players, is the fog, which is very reasonable because the town without fog can never be the same. Even though it started as a mechanical limitation, for players, the fog represented the ambiguity of the town, the line between reality and delusions, and the cover that hides horrors from your eyes. The third element is the psychology of the main character, because in Silent Hill games, the trauma and psyche of the protagonist can usually give you an idea of what to expect when it comes to monsters and manifestations you encounter, and whether they are profound or shallow. So based on these standards, storytelling must be ambiguous and symbolic rather than straightforward, leaving room for interpretation and speculation, a practice that Silent Hill fans admire to the core. The fourth element they care about is the balance between action and narrative, meaning that combat should not be an objective, but rather a tool that players can use to bypass certain obstacles. This also means that exploration should be central, and atmosphere must be the priority, while fighting enemies is nothing more than a struggle that highlights the town's horrors from time to time. The last element on the list is the dreamlike nature of your journey. Silent Hill fans hate it when the game tells them what's real and what's not, because what made the whole thing enticing in the first place was the character's inability to understand if they are in a nightmare or real life, or whether it's a mix between the two.
Mary?
Now that I have explained the first definition that some fans use, it's worth mentioning that there's another group of gamers that disagree a little bit, and their definition is more radical and narrow. These people believe that all the elements I stated are definitely essential in a Silent Hill experience, but they also believe that the cult is equally important. According to their logic, it makes no sense for the town to be scary and mysterious without highlighting the biggest force behind its supernatural power, which is the disturbing activities of the Order cult. In the original game, the cult sees the town as holy ground, and their rituals, sacrifices, and drug operations are tied directly to controlling the town and its people. Because of this, the cult's actions and the town's otherworldly shifts are deeply interconnected, and in theory, you can't separate one from the other.
I wish only for the salvation of mankind. But for that to happen, the world must first be remade.
In summary, many fans do actually have a clear idea of what a Silent Hill game is in their mind. But the problem is that they don't really know what they want beyond these borders, and their standards are not always consistent. For example, Silent Hill 2 doesn't have any direct connection to the original game, and the cult is not relevant at any point. It's basically a standalone journey showcasing new characters from a completely different perspective. But even with this fresh vision, people still loved it, and they didn't mind that it has its own story. Meanwhile, Silent Hill 4's story is deeply connected to the cult, and it centers around the consequences of events that are related to the original game and the third one. Yet people still had a tough time seeing it as a Silent Hill game. It's proof that the players can sometimes turn a blind eye to the creative liberty of developers, as long as they provide a worthy replacement to the traditional formula. This leads us to Silent Hill F. Can we really say it's a Silent Hill game, or is it too different to be in the club? If we take the elements that I mentioned earlier into account, we'll find that Silent Hill F goes hand in hand with some of them, while breaking far away from others. The most complicated component in the equation is obviously the setting, because the game doesn't take place in the usual town of Silent Hill, and it's not even close. It takes you all the way from the United States to Japan. But at the same time, the vibes, atmosphere, and ambiguity are equally powerful and feel familiar. So despite the fact that such a setting might not be what Silent Hill fans expected and wanted, in my opinion, it's really hard to see it as a negative. This Japanese environment is the best representation of a ghost town that I've seen in a long time. Not because it looks scary, but because it looks real and genuine. In the start, you see a very peaceful atmosphere. The sun is shining, the air is fresh, and the place is incredibly quiet. Features that are very common in a rural area, especially in Japan. Even the fog's presence is genius, because initially you'll see it flowing slowly in the air as if it's a natural phenomenon in the land. And if you didn't know that this is a Silent Hill game, you would not even notice that it's added for a deeper purpose. So, if I'm being honest and objective, the town and fog here are a masterpiece, and they succeed in forcing you to sense the Silent Hill vibe, even if it's in another country with different lore. When it comes to the psychology of the protagonist, this is when the game loses a bit of its charm. Not necessarily because the story is weak, but mostly due to the fact that the girl Hinako did not go through a uniquely disturbing experience compared to the older Silent Hill characters. Her trauma stems from bullying and social isolation at her school, heavy expectations from society, and abuse from her strict parents. She lives in a traditional town where she must follow certain rules as a girl, and her personal desires are often neglected and seen as worthless. Now make no mistake, these themes are definitely devastating and so serious. But just like many people mentioned before, they're not really unusual or bizarre in the 1960s, let alone in a town like this. To help you understand what I mean, let me remind you that this is not the first time in Silent Hill where we play as a teenage girl, because it already happened 22 years ago with Heather Mason in Silent Hill 3.
My name is Heather.
However, the difference is that the themes that were used to amplify Heather's trauma and mental struggle are literally so extreme that they might even be too much for today's standards. The themes I'm talking about are unwanted pregnancy, the intimate exploitation of girls, and predators forcing themselves on female prey. I'm using a light language on purpose here, but I guess you get what I mean. For casual players, the stuff I just mentioned might not be very obvious in the game, but once you focus deeply on the details, you will see a horrifying story. For example, the monsters that Heather faces throughout her journey are based on these fears, and the most spine-chilling example is Slurper. This monster's design is pure horror, and it's basically a combination of a man and a lizard, with an elongated face that has a long tongue, seemingly for tasting his prey. He crawls on the ground like an absolute maniac, and he always attacks Heather from low positions. But the catch is that it's not random. Slurper's behavior is intended to symbolize violation, humiliation, and vulnerability, because he doesn't want to kill Heather, but rather take advantage of her body. In other words, when he touches her legs and pins her down to the ground, he's doing it on purpose. And it's mainly because he wants to access her body that he eagerly desires. This monster's existence is meant to highlight Heather's fear of being stalked by predatory men and being forcefully touched intimately, which might lead to a pregnancy that she doesn't want. You can watch my previous video about the monsters to get a bigger picture of what I want to say.
Stay back!
Anyway, after explaining this point, I don't want you to think that Silent Hill F's psychology and symbolism are not frightening or deeply profound in their own way. In fact, the monsters here are the very thing that drove me to read between the lines and be more curious to understand their purpose. They are arguably some of the most hostile and engaging creatures in the franchise so far, and you can't really avoid observing them because they're all over the place. You have feminine marionette-style enemies roaming the town back and forth, searching for you, blind beasts that can track your location based on your sound, and knife-wielding giants that release poisonous substances from their stomachs. Each one has a distinct design that represents something more terrifying than you think. We'll make a video explaining the dark meanings behind their appearances, but for now, I can say that monsters in this game are far from being a weakness, and they are very relevant to the Silent Hill formula. However, just when the game gives you something that you absolutely admire, it somehow misses the mark on the other side. Despite the monsters being an amazing challenge in the experience, the combat itself makes it hard for you to appreciate it. And this is why Silent Hill F has a small problem in balancing action with narrative. The game was marketed from the very beginning as an action horror game, and since monsters are everywhere and the encounters are too many, it's clear that action was planned to be central. But sadly, the combat is designed to make these encounters so painful. You need to manage sanity, stamina, health, and weapon durability while delivering slow strikes that have a bizarre freeze during contact with the enemy. The animations are stiff, and the clunkiness is not justifiable, because the problem lies with the inconsistency between pressing the buttons and the action on the screen. It's true that over time you get used to it and you begin to handle it better, but overall, it remains my least favorite aspect of the game, especially when the hard mode makes enemies seem more invincible. When it comes to the dreamlike aspect, Silent Hill F does a good job in this department, and the transition between reality and the other world is so seamless and smooth that you can barely notice when it will happen. So, if I'm being honest, the question of whether Silent Hill F is a real Silent Hill game or not can only be answered by you. Because the game has the foundation for an incredible experience and solid psychological horror, but their influence can differ from one player to another. And let's be real, if we keep questioning every new Silent Hill game about its identity, then when the heck will this argument stop? Downpour took place in Silent Hill Town, and Shattered Memories was the epitome of psychological horror, yet they were both dealing with the same pushback that F is facing right now. This makes you wonder, are the new Silent Hill games doomed to be haunted by the golden era forever? Or can we finally accept that the franchise has to move forward and expand just like Resident Evil did? Anyway, please like the video if you enjoyed it, and let me know in the comments below what you think about the Silent Hill identity.
Friends don't last forever. They will betray you eventually.